Some names don't just identify you. They expose the truth you've been running from. The restaurant was quiet, the kind of polished silence money buys, filled with soft jazz and low voices discussing million-dollar deals as if they were nothing. Richard Hale sat alone at the corner table, his $4,000 suit perfectly pressed, his attention locked on his phone. When the waitress placed a cup of black coffee beside him, he didn't look up. "Keep the change," he said flatly, even though there was no cash on the table. Not a single dollar. Just the receipt. If you've ever seen a moment where someone shows their real character in seconds, you already know. Sometimes it says more than words ever could. The waitress paused for half a second, barely noticeable, then folded the check with steady hands. "Of course, sir," she said softly. No attitude. No reaction. Just calm. Her name tag caught the light as she turned away. Emily. She moved with quiet precision, like someone who had learned not to take things personally, or maybe someone who understood more than she let on. Around them, a couple at the next table exchanged a glance, the kind people share when they witness something unfair but choose silence. Richard didn't notice. He signed the receipt with a quick, careless stroke, the pen scratching across paper like it meant nothing. To him, it didn't. Money was a measure. People were variables. And service? Service was expected. Seconds passed. He reached for the receipt again, almost absent-mindedly, as if something unfinished was tugging at him. Maybe it was the stillness in the air. Maybe it was the way she hadn't reacted. His eyes dropped to the bottom corner. The name printed there, Emily Carter. His fingers stopped. Completely. The noise of the restaurant faded into something distant, like he'd stepped underwater. Carter. He read it again, slower this time. Carter. The name didn't just sound familiar. It felt heavy, like something unfinished. His grip tightened slightly on the paper, the edge bending under his thumb. Somewhere deep in his memory, a door creaked open. A courtroom. Fluorescent lights. A man standing across from him, voice shaking but determined. "Please, this is everything we have." Richard blinked, but the image didn't go away. He lifted his head slowly, scanning the room until he found her. Emily stood near the counter, speaking quietly with another server, her posture relaxed, her face unreadable. But then she looked up, straight at him, not surprised, not curious, just aware, as if she'd been waiting for that exact moment. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Hale didn't know what to do next. Richard did not move, not at first, as if shifting even an inch might confirm something he was not ready to face. The receipt remained in his hand, the paper now slightly creased where his fingers had tightened without him noticing. Emily Carter. The name echoed again, louder this time, no longer distant but pressing, demanding recognition. He had built his life on precision, on remembering numbers, contracts, outcomes. Nothing slipped through. And yet, for a moment, he wished this had. Across the room, Emily turned back to her work, pouring water into a glass with steady hands, speaking politely to another table as if nothing had changed. But something had. The air between them had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm you cannot yet see. Richard stood slowly, adjusting his jacket out of habit, though his movements lacked their usual confidence. He took a step forward, then stopped again, watching her. She did not rush. She did not avoid him either. It was as if she knew he would come to her when he was ready, not a second sooner. That calm unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. Most people, when faced with him, reacted. They tried to impress, to defend, to gain something. She had done none of that. She had simply been. His mind continued to pull at fragments, incomplete images refusing to form a full picture. A document signed late at night. A company acquisition that had seemed routine at the time. A small name buried in a stack of many. Carter Holdings. That was it. The name surfaced with sudden clarity, and with it came a memory he had long filed away as insignificant. A family-owned business. Struggling. Desperate for time. He had not given it. Efficiency did not allow for hesitation. He had made the decision in less than 10 minutes, approving the takeover that would dissolve the company within weeks. It had been clean, legal, profitable. He remembered the numbers. He did not remember the faces. Until now. He exhaled slowly, realizing he had been holding his breath. The distance between him and Emily suddenly felt longer than the entire room, as if each step carried weight. When he finally moved, it was deliberate, controlled, but no longer effortless. Emily noticed him approaching before he reached her. She turned, meeting his gaze with the same quiet steadiness. Up close, there was nothing dramatic about her expression. No anger, no accusation, just a stillness that made everything else feel louder. Richard stopped a few feet away, the words forming slowly, unfamiliar in his mouth. "Emily Carter," he said, as if saying it out loud might change something. She nodded once. "Yes, sir." Her voice was calm, professional, but there was something beneath it now, something that had not been there before. Recognition, not of who he was in the world, but of who he had been in hers. Richard glanced down at the receipt again, then back at her, his composure beginning to fracture in ways no one in that room would have believed possible. "Your last name," he said carefully. "It sounds familiar." Emily tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the statement without confirming it. "It usually does," she replied softly. And in that moment, the silence between them grew heavier, not empty, but filled with everything that had yet to be said. Richard felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not sharp, not immediate, but heavy, like a truth slowly rising to the surface after years buried too deep to notice. He studied her face more carefully now, searching for traces of the memory that refused to fully form. Emily did not look away. That, more than anything, unsettled him. Most people avoided direct eye contact with him, especially in moments like this. They lowered their gaze, shifted uncomfortably, or filled the silence with unnecessary words. She did none of that. She simply stood there, present, grounded, as if she had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. "Carter Holdings," he said quietly, the words finally finding their way out. The reaction was subtle. A small pause. A breath held for half a second, then released. "Yes," Emily replied. No elaboration. No denial. Just confirmation. Richard's mind filled in the rest before she could say anything more. The company had been small, family-run, operating out of a modest office somewhere outside the city. He remembered the file now, thin compared to the others on his desk that day. Declining revenue. Mounting debt. A request for extension. He had declined it, not out of malice, but because it did not fit the model. Numbers did not lie, and the numbers had been clear. He had signed the approval for acquisition, closed the deal, and moved on to the next opportunity before the ink had even dried. Efficient, clean, profitable. That was how he had always described it. Emily watched him process it, the realization unfolding in real time across his face. She had seen that look before, though not on him. On her father. The night everything changed. The night he sat at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, papers spread out in front of him, reading the same paragraph over and over, as if it might change if he looked at it long enough. She had been standing in the hallway, just out of sight, watching him. She remembered the way his shoulders had slumped, not dramatically, just slightly, as if something inside him had quietly given up. No shouting, no anger, just silence. The kind that lingers. The kind that stays. He believed in that company, she said softly, her voice steady but distant, as if she were speaking about someone she had known a long time ago. Richard did not interrupt. For once, he did not try to control the direction of the conversation. He built it from nothing, she continued. 15 years. Late nights. Weekends. He used to say it was not just a business. It was proof. She paused, searching for the right word, then let it go. Proof that hard work still mattered. Richard felt the weight of each word, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they were not. They were simple, honest, and impossible to dismiss. And when it was gone, Emily added, he did not talk about it much after that. She met his eyes again, and this time there was something deeper there. Not anger, not resentment. Something quieter, stronger. Neither did you. The statement landed without accusation, but it did not need one. Richard swallowed, his usual certainty nowhere to be found. For the first time in years, he was not the one with control of the narrative. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything he had chosen not to remember. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, but Emily did not rush to fill it. And that was where the tension lived, in what she chose not to say and what he could no longer ignore. Richard shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement, but for a man who built empires on certainty, it felt like losing ground. I did not know, he said finally, the words sounding weaker than he expected, like they did not belong to him. Emily's expression did not change, but her eyes held his for a moment longer before she glanced down at the table he had left behind, the untouched tip, the folded receipt, the quiet evidence of who he had been just minutes ago. "You did not ask," she replied gently, not harsh, not bitter, just precise. The difference mattered. Richard inhaled slowly, the kind of measured breath he used in negotiations, but this was different, because there was nothing to negotiate. "We reviewed hundreds of cases that year," he continued, as if context might soften the edges. "Decisions had to be made quickly." Even as he said it, he knew how it sounded. Efficient, logical, detached. Emily nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. "I am sure they did," she said. "That is what makes it easier, right? When everything becomes a number." Her tone remained calm, but there was a quiet clarity in her words that cut deeper than anger ever could. Richard looked at her more closely now, noticing details he had missed before. The way she carried herself, the steadiness in her posture. This was not someone broken by what happened. This was someone shaped by it. "You stayed," he said, almost to himself. "You built something anyway." Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, though it did not quite reach her eyes. "Not everything has to be built in glass towers," she replied. "Some things are smaller, quieter, but they still matter." Richard followed her gaze as she looked across the room, taking in the restaurant, the people, the simple rhythm of conversations and clinking glasses. It was a different kind of world from his, one he had always considered temporary, transitional, something people moved through on their way to something bigger. But standing there now, he was not so sure. "Your father," he began, then stopped, unsure how to continue in a way that did not feel like an intrusion. Emily saved him from finishing the sentence. "He is still alive," she said. "He just does not talk about business anymore." There was a pause, softer this time, less sharp but heavier in meaning. "He fixes things now," she added. "Small things. Neighbors' fences. Old radios. Anything that can be repaired." Richard nodded slowly, the image settling into his mind with an unexpected weight. A man who once built something from nothing, now spending his days fixing what others discard. It was not failure. It was something else. Something quieter. Something harder to define. "And you?" he asked, the question leaving his mouth before he could filter it. Emily met his gaze again, steady as ever. "I work," she said simply. "I learn. I keep moving." Then, after a brief pause, she added, "And I remember." The words lingered between them, not as a threat, but as a truth that did not need to be explained. Richard felt it settle in, deeper than anything she had said before. Because remembering meant something different here. It meant she had not turned away from what happened. It meant she had carried it, quietly, without needing to prove anything to anyone. He glanced down once more at the receipt still in his hand, then back at her, realizing that whatever he chose to say next would not undo anything. The past was already written, and for the first time, that realization did not feel like control. It felt like consequence. Richard lowered his gaze to the receipt again, but this time he did not just see a name. He saw the weight behind it. And for a man who had spent years believing everything could be measured, calculated, and resolved, the realization unsettled him more than he expected. He reached into his wallet, pulling out a thick stack of cash without counting, placing it slowly on the table behind him. It was more than enough, far more than any tip would ever require, the kind of gesture that had always worked before, the kind that closed gaps, ended conversations, restored balance. He turned back to Emily, his voice quieter now. "This will not change what happened," he said, almost as if he were admitting it to himself. "But it is a start." Emily followed his movement with her eyes, then looked back at him, her expression unchanged. She did not move toward the money. She did not even glance at it again. "No," she said gently, "it is not." The words were not dismissive, but they were final. Richard frowned slightly, not in frustration, but in confusion, as if encountering a system that did not respond to the rules he understood. "Then tell me what is," he asked. Emily held his gaze for a moment, then stepped past him, walking back to the table. She picked up the receipt, unfolded it, and smoothed it flat against the surface, her movements careful, deliberate. Then, instead of taking the cash, she reached for the pen he had used earlier. Richard watched, something tightening in his chest as he realized he did not know what she was about to do. Emily wrote something on the bottom of the receipt, her handwriting steady, unhurried. When she finished, she placed the pen down and turned the paper toward him. Richard stepped closer, his eyes dropping to the words she had added beneath his signature. It was not a number, not a request, just a single line. You were the last person he tried to call. The sentence hit harder than anything she had said aloud. Richard's breath caught, and for a moment, the room around him seemed to disappear entirely. A memory surfaced, sharper now, no longer fragmented. A missed call. Late evening. Unknown number. He had declined it without thinking, already moving on to the next meeting, the next deal, the next decision that demanded his attention. He had not thought about it since. Until now. His hand moved slightly, as if to steady himself against the table, but he stopped halfway, the motion incomplete. I did not know it was him, he said quietly, though the words felt hollow even as they left his mouth. Emily did not respond immediately. She simply watched him, her expression softening just enough to show that she understood the difference between intention and consequence. No, she said after a moment. You did not. Another pause settled between them, heavier this time, because it carried something new, something that had not been present before. Not just memory, not just regret, but connection. Not chosen, not invited, but real. Richard looked down at the receipt again, at the simple line that had shifted everything, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something he could not quantify, could not solve, could not buy his way out of. And the silence that followed was no longer just between two people. It was between who he had been and who he was starting to realize he might have to become. The words on the receipt did not fade. They stayed there, steady, undeniable, as if they had been waiting years to be read. Richard's fingers hovered over the paper but did not touch it, like even the slightest contact might make it more real. A missed call. One decision. One moment he had dismissed without a second thought. And now it stood in front of him, not as data, not as a report, but as a consequence with a face. Emily did not move to take the receipt back. She let him sit with it, let the silence do what words no longer needed to do. Around them, the restaurant continued as if nothing had happened. Glasses clinked, quiet laughter rose and fell, but at their table, time felt suspended. Richard finally exhaled, slow and unsteady. I would have answered, he said, though even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice, not because it was untrue, but because it was unprovable. Emily's gaze softened just slightly, not in forgiveness, but in understanding. Maybe, she said. Or maybe you would have let it go to voicemail like everything else that did not fit into your schedule. The honesty of it did not cut, it settled. Heavy. Real. Richard nodded once, accepting the possibility without defense. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emily reached for the receipt, folding it neatly again, not to hide the words, but to close the moment. She placed it back on the table, right beside the stack of cash he had offered, but she had not touched. You cannot go back to that day, she said quietly. Neither can I. Richard looked at the money, then back at her, something shifting behind his eyes, not calculation, not strategy, something less familiar. Then what happens now? He asked. It was not a demand. It was a question he did not know how to answer on his own. Emily studied him for a second longer, as if weighing something invisible. That depends, she said, on whether this is just a moment for you, or a change. The words lingered, not dramatic, but decisive. A line drawn. Without force. Richard felt it, the difference between reacting and transforming, between writing a check and rewriting something deeper. He had built his entire life on solving problems quickly, efficiently, closing gaps with money, influence, speed. But this did not move. This did not resolve. It stayed. And that unsettled him more than any negotiation ever had. A voice from across the room called Emily's name, pulling her attention back for a brief second. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at him. I have other tables, she said simply. No rush. No dismissal. Just reality. Richard nodded, but did not step away. Emily, he said, stopping her just as she turned. She looked back. He hesitated, searching for something that felt honest enough to say. If you were in my position, he asked slowly, what would you do? It was not a question he had ever asked anyone before, especially not someone he had just refused to tip minutes ago. Emily considered him, really looked at him this time, as if seeing not the billionaire, not the decision-maker, but the man standing there, uncertain for the first time. And for a moment, If someone were watching this unfold, they might wonder what they would say in her place, whether they would walk away, or stay, or ask for something more. Emily finally spoke, her voice calm, grounded. "I would start by not trying to fix it with money," she said. Then she paused, just long enough to make sure he understood. "And I would be ready to hear things you cannot control." Richard held her gaze, the weight of that answer settling deeper than anything else she had said so far. Because for the first time, he realized this was not about what he could give. It was about what he was willing to face. Emily did not walk away immediately after speaking. Instead, she paused for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, as if there was something else she could say, something she chose not to. Then she turned, moving back into the rhythm of the restaurant, blending into the quiet motion of trays, glasses, and soft voices. But Richard could not return to his seat the same way. Something had shifted too far. He remained standing there, the folded receipt still in his hand, her words echoing in a way that did not fade. Not about money, not about control, about facing something he had never needed to face before. He slowly made his way back to the table, but he did not sit. Instead, he looked at the items left behind, the untouched coffee now gone cold, the stack of cash still where he had placed it, and the receipt that no longer felt like paper but like evidence. His eyes moved again to the bottom corner, to the line she had written, and this time he noticed something he had missed before. Beneath her sentence, faint but deliberate, there was a second detail. A number. Not random. Not decorative. A date. He frowned slightly, leaning closer. It was the same date as the missed call, but there was something else about it. Something precise. He pulled out his phone without thinking, his fingers moving quickly, searching through archived records he had not opened in years. Emails, call logs, documents tied to that acquisition. The deeper he went, the more the details aligned in ways he had never cared to examine. The call had come in less than 30 minutes before the final approval. 30 minutes. That was all the time between a request and a decision that had changed everything. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in realization. That window had existed. Brief, uncomfortable, but real. He had simply chosen not to look at it. Across the room, Emily glanced in his direction again, just briefly, as if checking whether he had seen it yet. Not the money, not the confrontation, the detail, the timing, the space where something different could have happened. And now, standing there, Richard understood that the story he had told himself for years, about efficiency, about necessity, about how there had been no alternative, was no longer complete. There had been a moment. Small, easy to ignore, but it had been there. He looked back down at the receipt, then at the date again, and for the first time, the question forming in his mind was not about what he could fix now, but what he had chosen not to see then. And that question did not have a quick answer. It lingered, growing heavier with each passing second. Emily returned to another table, her voice calm, her movements unchanged, but something about her presence now felt different to him. Not just because of who she was, but because of what she knew. Because she had not brought this up immediately. She had waited, watched, let him reveal himself first. If someone were watching this moment unfold, they might wonder the same thing Richard was beginning to understand. Was this just coincidence, a name and a memory colliding in one place? Or had she known all along that this moment would happen exactly like this? And if she had known, then the question was no longer just about the past. It was about why she had chosen now to let him see it. Richard stared at the screen of his phone, the timestamp glowing back at him as if it had been waiting all these years to be noticed. And then something else caught his eye, something he had completely overlooked before, a short voicemail transcription attached to that missed call. Only a few words, automatically generated, easy to ignore at the time, but impossible to dismiss now. He tapped it open, his thumb hesitating for just a second before pressing play. The audio was not clear, slightly distorted, rushed, but the voice carried through. "Mr. Hale, this is Daniel Carter. I just need 10 minutes. There is something you should know before you sign." The message cut off abruptly, like it had been recorded in a moment of urgency. Richard felt his chest tighten, not sharply, but steadily, as the meaning settled in. 10 minutes. That was all the man had asked for. Not money, not a favor, just time. Richard lowered the phone slowly, the weight of it now disproportionate to its size. Across the room, Emily was already walking toward him, not hurried, not dramatic, but intentional. She stopped a few steps away, watching him with that same quiet steadiness. "You found it," she said, not as a question, but as a confirmation. Richard nodded once, his voice slower now, measured in a way that had nothing to do with control. "He knew," he said. "He knew something I did not." Emily's gaze softened, but there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of being proven right. Only truth. "Yes," she said. Richard looked back down at his phone, then at the receipt, then at her, the pieces aligning in a way that changed everything. "What was it?" he asked. "What did he need to tell me?" Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, then stepped closer, just enough to close the distance, but not enough to invade it. "The company you acquired," she said quietly. "It was not failing the way your reports said." Richard's brow furrowed slightly, the instinct to challenge the statement rising, but he stopped himself. "We had verified data," he replied, though the certainty in his voice was already fading. Emily nodded. "You had what was given to you," she said, "but not everything that was true." The distinction landed heavier than any accusation. Richard's mind moved quickly now, not to defend, but to reconstruct. Reports, analysts, recommendations, layers of information he had trusted without question because they had always been accurate before, always aligned, always efficient. "There was a pending contract," Emily continued, her voice steady, controlled. "A partnership that would have cleared their debt within 90 days. It was already signed, already in motion." Richard's breath slowed, his thoughts catching on the implication. "That was not in the file," he said quietly. Emily shook her head slightly. "Because it was never meant to be," she replied. The silence that followed was different now. Sharper. Not just personal, but systemic. Richard felt it expand beyond the table, beyond the restaurant, into something much larger than a single decision. "If I had taken that call," he said slowly, "I would have known." Emily did not answer immediately. She let the question sit, let it unfold in its full weight before responding. "Yes," she said, "you would have known." Richard closed his eyes briefly, not to escape, but to process, and when he opened them again, the world felt different, not because it had changed, but because his understanding of it had. This was no longer just about a missed call. It was about a truth that had been hidden, a decision made on incomplete information, and a system he had trusted without ever questioning who benefited from what was left out. He looked at Emily again, really looked this time, seeing not just the daughter of a man he had wronged, but someone who had carried a piece of a larger story he had never been told. And in that moment, the realization settled in fully. This was not just his mistake. It was something deeper. And the question was no longer whether he could fix what had happened. It was whether he was ready to uncover why it had happened in the first place. Richard did not speak right away, because for the first time in a long time, words felt insufficient, like they would only shrink what he was beginning to understand into something smaller than it deserved to be. He looked at Emily, really looked, and saw not just the quiet strength she carried, but the years behind it, the weight she had learned to hold without asking anyone to notice. Then he looked down at the table one last time, at the money he had placed there so confidently just minutes ago, and slowly, deliberately, he gathered it back into his hand. Not out of pride, not out of refusal, but because he finally understood it did not belong in this moment. He set his wallet down instead, untouched, as if to remind himself that not everything required it. "I cannot undo what I did," he said quietly. "No justification, no explanation, just truth." Emily nodded once, because she already knew that. "No," she replied. Richard took a slow breath, steadying himself in a way that had nothing to do with control anymore. "But I can choose what I do next," he added. This time, there was something different in his voice. Not certainty, not power, intention. Emily studied him for a moment, not judging, not rushing, simply observing, the way she had done from the beginning. "Then do not choose quickly," she said softly. "That is how you got here." The words landed gently, but they stayed. Richard gave a small nod, accepting it without resistance. He glanced around the restaurant, at the ordinary details he had once overlooked, the quiet conversations, the simple presence of people who were not measuring their lives in numbers, and for the first time, he did not feel above it. He felt part of something he had ignored for too long. When he looked back at Emily, there was no longer a distance defined by roles or status. Just two people standing in the same moment, shaped by different sides of the same decision. Will you let me try? He asked. It was not a request for forgiveness. It was a question about possibility. Emily held his gaze, her expression calm, grounded, unchanged in its dignity. Trying is not something you ask permission for, she said. It is something you prove. Then she stepped back, not as a rejection, but as space. Space for him to act, or not. Space for him to decide who he would be when this moment was no longer in front of him. Richard nodded once more, understanding that there would be no immediate resolution, no clean ending he could walk away with. This was not a transaction. It was a beginning. He placed the receipt carefully back on the table, not folded this time, but open, the words visible, a reminder he chose not to hide. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit, not hurried, not distracted, but aware. Behind him, Emily returned to her work, her movement steady, her presence unchanged, because for her, this moment was not about altering the past. It was about witnessing the present. And as the door closed softly behind him, the restaurant returned to its quiet rhythm, but something invisible had shifted. Not in the room, not in the air, but in a man who had finally realized that the smallest moments, the ones he used to ignore, were the ones that defined everything. And sometimes, the most powerful change does not begin with what you say, but with what you finally choose to see.